Hi, Suzanne.
Hi,
How are you?
good. How are you?
Good. I'm very grateful that this is working. I've never done or been on the other side of organizing a webinar before, so I got on early to make sure the link worked.
Oh, good. Yeah, I haven't either. So I was nervous about getting in, so I
Yeah,
came
me
early.
too. Me too. How's everything going? You're in California. I've seen beautiful pictures on Facebook. Looks like you're getting out hiking a lot.
Oh yeah, it's really nice.
Hi there.
Hi, Deb.
Yay, it's all working so far. We have 0 attendees, but there doesn't appear to be a way for me to actually keep attendees out until we want to let them in. So
Okay, so will we see their video or will they just be joining?
they'll just be joining. You guys, if you open up participants, you can see the panelists. We're all there, and then you can see attendees.
Perfect.
And right now it's 0, but I just came on a few minutes ago, and there
cool.
were, and as soon as I got on, 2 attendees came on.
Oh, wow.
So, and I went looking around for how to, I could kick them off, but I mean, how to like keep the doors closed until they come in. And I don't see a way to do that. So I'm new to this. It's okay. Well, we're going to make it work.
Yeah.
Everything else seems to be in order. So
yeah, thanks for running point on this. I appreciate it because never done this either.
Suzanne, you didn't happen to see Mia yet, did you? I guess she's busy. That's good.
See who?
I have a 1-month-old.
Oh, I know. I was going to ask you about that actually. How is she?
She's good. She's sleeping, thankfully. Yeah, we'll see if she makes an appearance. Yeah, my partner is watching her during the webinar, so we'll see. I filled a bottle for her, so she's got food waiting.
I remember those days.
Good. It's so like, yeah, I feel like I'm still not 100% there. I mean, you're both moms, so I'm like, my brain's in that fuzzy stage. So I'm gonna try to
She's a month old. Oh my God, it took me practically a year to regain that.
I know. Sienna was like 2 months old, and Deb was like, you were so kind. You emailed me, and you're like, so when are you gonna start writing? And I'm like, yes, you're right. And it was fine. Mm-hmm. That got me going.
Was she your first, Suzanne?
No, she was my second.
Okay.
Yeah.
I definitely think it's easier and some things are easier the second time around. You just like, we have the infrastructure set up, but it is then you're balancing too. So thankfully daycare has remained open. So it's not too much balancing.
Daycare was huge when Sienna was born.
Yeah. Hi, Catherine. Hi, Amanda.
Hello, everybody.
Hi. So exciting to actually see everyone's faces after communicating via email for so long.
Amanda working on your sound. Okay.
Yep, I just got it. Hi, everyone. How are you?
Good to see you again so quickly.
I know, likewise. Thanks for all your work organizing this webinar, Deb. Like, I really was appreciating today the learning curve that you had to experience, because I'm like, I don't know how to do any of it.
I was going to say,
do I
did this? Can I get your advice? there's only one thing that I wish that I knew how to do that I'm not figuring out. We have one person already on as an attendee. So I wanted to be able to keep the attendee doors closed till a certain moment and then let everyone in. And I don't see that option. Other than that, I'm good. Like, I know how to manage pretty much all that I need to manage, including, as Suzanne reminded me, how to kick somebody off if necessary. but that's an issue. So we do have, probably will have a growing number of people listening to us as we chat.
That's great. Thank you for letting us know that. Welcome, everyone. Thanks.
Right, exactly. Welcome, everyone. It's a chance to chat, and they can observe us chat too, I guess. We don't have much else to sort out. Everybody sees a share screen down there, right? Good. Laura is officially an alternative host, and I'm not quite sure what that gives her permission to do that the rest of you don't have. But if we need something to happen that the host has to do, either Laura or I should have permissions to do it.
Are we?
Yeah, go ahead.
Are we pretty rigid with the minutes? Like, should we really aim to stay within 7 to 8 minutes?
I think so. I mean, I know some people said that theirs are a little bit shorter, like more like 6 minutes. I'm not sure how long Sophia couldn't join, but she sent a video. And I'm not sure how long her video is, but
It's 10 minutes. She
Okay.
apologized for that, but and she asked if she should do it again for that reason, but she was exhausted, and so I kind of gave her a pass.
I understand
But
that.
I would say yes, to try to stick to the
Okay.
time you have, because that will give us the time we want with a Q&A at the end. And then if there's anything that you couldn't, didn't have time for, there'll probably be a chance to speak to it at the end.
Yeah. I know what to cut out. I was going to talk
Okay.
about their parents a little bit, but I'll just, they don't even know about the parents.
Yeah, and
If
we
they do,
budgeted
I mean-
for yeah, we're just paired. We budgeted for like 10 minutes for each person, so we built in like 2 minutes for transition.
Oh,
If
okay.
the transitions are kind of fast,
I
then
kept recording and it was at 10 minutes and I was like, like, so. Or
Ours was a little shorter.
So I've just turned on the recording, and Maria, if you'd like to kick us off anytime you're ready, I think we can get going.
Sure, that sounds great. Well, I just want to say hello to everybody on behalf of the Bilingual Education Research SIG this year. I'm really appreciative of everybody taking the time to be here, and want to welcome members of the SIG and other guests for being here and spending time with us wherever you are right now. I especially want to say thank you to the panelists who have agreed to present their work to us professionally. This was one of the 5 symposiums that was scheduled for the 2020 AERA conference that was initially to be held on site and then virtually. And so it ended up that we've postponed it till this year and until April of 2021. But this is one of the very important symposiums that was accepted by the SIG, and the work of these scholars is tremendous. So true testament to their work is the number of people who have signed up today. So I just want to welcome everybody, and a special thanks and shout out to 3 people in particular. First is Laura Hammond, who has really organized and been the backbone of a lot of this work for the SIG. And some of her work may be lesser known to some of you, but she has been instrumental in a hard work. We're so grateful for all that she does. I especially want to thank Deb Palmer for hosting from the University of Colorado Boulder, my alma mater. Love you guys. So proud of all the work that you do. We're grateful for that. And I want to say hello and thank you again to Veronica Valdez, who was the chair last year at the time of the conference when this presentation, the symposium was supposed to occur. So thank you to the panelists, especially for all of your work. And one final note is, we're kind of pulling on to 2021 with a breath of fresh air this year with a new administration. I'm very optimistic, but I want to thank all of the members for the intellectual rigor that we have as a community of scholars. I'm especially appreciative of all of you that not only call us out, but call us in, keep ourselves honest and faithful to the cause, social justice and equity in multiple forms. And I know that we have made a lot of waves over the past few years, and we've done a lot of great things, but there's still a lot left to do. So thank you for your contribution and scholarship. And I won't take any more time, but welcome.
Thank you so much, Maria. It's an honor to be able to share this work, and we're just so grateful to the SIG for making space for this. And I also wanted to say thank you to all of the panelists who are here today, who've shared their articles and also their time and effort to be here. So yeah, we're so excited. We are over 100 attendees already. So we'll get started. Deb and I are going to begin with a brief introduction, and then we're going to have an opportunity to hear from each of the authors, each of the panelists regarding the paper that they contributed. So thank you so much. And I also want to say a really big thank you to Deb for all the help with coordinating the webinar and the whole special issue. All right, we'll see if this goes through. Okay, great. So as Maria mentioned, this This webinar is a long time coming. It was initially meant to be a presentation or a symposium at the conference that was canceled at AERA. But even before that, starting in 2018, when Suzanne and Sophia, two of the authors who contributed to the special issue, and I were on a panel at AAAL, and I approached Deb back in the fall of 2018 about putting together a special issue on this topic. So it's been a very long time coming. And I'm so proud of all the work that's gone into it and the really amazing scholarship that we get to present for you today. So this is how we're envisioning structuring the webinar. We'll begin with about 7 minutes of an introduction just to present what the special issue is, some of the ideas framing it. And then each author or group of authors will have about 8 minutes to present their article. And we're going to go through, there's 6 articles in the special issue. So each paper will be presented briefly, and then we want to keep the remaining time, which will be about 20 minutes at the end, for audience Q&A. And so if you have questions as papers are being presented, please put them in the Q&A, and I'll be monitoring that as we go through the webinar. And then at the very end, and you're welcome to ask questions then too, we'll pull some of those questions to be addressed by our panelists. So that is where we're headed for today. So I wanted to begin just by addressing what two-way bilingual education is, since it's a very particular type of model, and it's the model that we're addressing in this set of articles in this special issue. Sorry, I should have mentioned, the special issue is in the International Journal of Bilingual Education and Bilingualism, and just came out this past summer. So all of these articles have been published, so you're able to read more deeply into any of these pieces being presented today. So two-way bilingual education, as imagine many of you do know, is a program model that teaches content and literacy in and through 2 languages. Many of the programs in the United States focus on English and Spanish, but any 2 languages can be used. And importantly, these programs also are designed to be integrative. So they integrate majority and minoritized language speakers. And this is a visual that I often use to talk about these programs. You can see my affinity for scare quotes everywhere, because in our work, the work that we're doing in this special issue, we're seeking to problematize some of the way that these labels are used. So talking about the English language of instruction and the Spanish language of instruction, talking about English speakers and Spanish speakers. So part of the work that we seek to do together is to dismantle some of these rigid binaries that are often used when these programs are being talked about. And you'll see throughout these articles that are in these presentations that we may use different terms. Two-way bilingual education is the term that Deb and I use in the introduction to the special issue to recenter bilingual, the B word, as it's sometimes called, in two-way programs. They're sometimes called dual language immersion, two-way immersion, dual language bilingual education. But all of the programs that we're talking about today are those that teach through 2 languages and that integrate majority and minoritized language speakers. So why did we decide that this special issue is needed? There's been growing concern within the field of bilingual education for some time now about dual language programs as being boutique language models or language education models, and that the danger of these programs furthering social inequities. Going all the way back to Valdez's initial cautionary note about the danger of these programs privileging and prioritizing white middle-class English speakers over the largely Latinx or language minoritized students that bilingual programs in the US were originally designed to serve. And yet within this, the large body of research that's begun to take more critical lenses on dual language programs or two-way bilingual programs, there hasn't been as much research on student perspectives and experiences. And yet we know from some of the existing research that students from different cultural, racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic backgrounds do have different experiences in and of these programs. And so if our aim as a community is to foster more equity-oriented bilingual programs, it's important that we understand student identities, student perspectives, and student experiences. And so this is the rationale, the call that brings all of this work we're going to be presenting today together as we start to think about how students are making sense of these programs, the identities that they're forming within them, and then what we can do with that understanding as we move forward to think about more equitable models.
Just real quick, thank you. I'm Deb Palmer and I'm very excited to be here. So thanks to all the panelists and to Maria for that lovely introduction. We are really honored to represent the SIG today. And we really hope that folks do look up these articles. They're all out and they're all really rich and very, very good reading. So the literature, both research and practitioner literature in two-way bilingual education has long sort of framed out 3 core goals, which I'm sure a lot of the folks in this audience will be familiar with. For all of these programs, they share the goals of academic achievement for all participants, bilingualism and biliteracy for all participants, and sociocultural competence. This third goal, I guess sociocultural competence, although it's been called other things through history, is the most connected to identity construction, but it's also had the least research carried out about it. First of all, it's been largely focused on understanding others rather than selves, communicative competence with others. And second, much of the research that is out there has been survey-based, which is Feinauer and Howard note in their 2014 review of that literature, may have a tendency to obscure issues of situated power dynamics and some of the more nuanced ways that students co-construct their identities in interaction in schools. So lately there's been a call to bring up a 4th goal to two-way bilingual ed programs, drawing on a long history in the field of bilingual ed to center criticality. We're joining scholars who call for centering critical consciousness, also called sociopolitical consciousness, as a core goal, and thereby giving it warranted attention across all levels and in all aspects of two-way bilingual programs. So this collection of papers contributes to a growing body of qualitative literature addressing that 3rd goal, sociocultural competence, using critical lenses and beginning to explore identity potential in two-way bilingual programs that embrace critical sociopolitical consciousness at the core. So some have argued that student identity itself should be a core goal of two-way bilingual programs. We see the negotiation of self and other as necessarily embedded within the aims of sociocultural competence and critical sociopolitical consciousness. An understanding of others begins with an understanding of the self, and the development of critical consciousness requires a deep engagement with one's own positionality within and in relation to both micro and macro structures of power. So across all these papers, we share a few definitions. We all understand identity, as Hall puts it, not where we are or where we come from so much as what we might become, how we have been represented, and how that bears on how we might represent ourselves. We see identity as a situated, negotiated, co-constructed activity, as what G calls recognition work. And we see language as inherently interrelated with identity, and as promoting, supporting, and hosting identity emergence. And we see bilingualism as dynamic, holistic, varied. There are many ways to do being bilingual. So across all these papers, we share these definitions, but you'll also see that the papers are more particular as they define identity and language in different ways and draw on different frameworks to enhance their own examinations. So also, so these are the papers that you'll hear, and they range, they articulate, grade levels from kindergarten all the way through grade 12 in a range of different geographic contexts. We have Midwest, Texas, Southeast, Northeast. And so now I'm going to go ahead and move right on to the authors to share their screens each in turn in this order, beginning with Dr. Esther de Jong, representing the first paper, Two-Way Bilingual Ed Programs, Sense of Belonging, Perspectives from Middle School Students. Go ahead, Esther.
Good afternoon, evening, everybody. I hope you can see my screen here. It's my pleasure to present our study. And I want to start with a shout out to my 2 co-authors who could not be here today. Zach Golter was instrumental for the data analysis of the study and supporting the writing of the paper. He's a doc student here at the University of Florida. And Dr. Tsai was a doc student, helped tremendously with data collection and analysis, and is now in Taiwan being a professor there. So our study, one of the things that, and here we go, let's try this. Always when we start thinking about two-way programs, we often focus on elementary programs. And so the secondary literature definitely needs a lot more attention. And one of the things that we're finding, of course, at the secondary level, it just gets to be more complicated. Scheduling gets complicated, staffing gets complicated, thinking about school transitions from elementary to middle school, from middle school to high school becomes part of the picture. But one of the things that we've found in the work that we did prior to this particular study is how important for particularly adolescents identity work is. And yet often, even in the studies that have focused on secondary programs, the focus tends to still be on outcomes and evaluative kinds of studies. And so there definitely is a real need to do more research on what happens with identity in the context of secondary programs. So we were very fortunate that we were able to look at middle school for our study. This particular study builds on the work that I had done with Dr. Carol Beers earlier. And one of the things that we found was that this idea of program identity actually seemed to be playing a role in the experiences and the identity construction of students. And so we took that idea with this study and realized that ultimately, this is really about a sense of belonging and connection and engagement with school. And as we were thinking about that for secondary students, we realized looking at the literature that that sense of belonging becomes very important for middle and high schoolers, and often gets less or harder as they move from an elementary context to a secondary context. And this often is particularly important for minoritized students. And so for this particular study, we took this idea of sense of belonging, recognizing how important it is for students' sense of identity and feeling part of the school, and applied that into the context of two-way bilingual education. And we've kind of looked at that, but we don't necessarily name it in our work. So we do think of belonging maybe as having positive attitudes, for example, towards the program and towards people's peers. It's kind of sense of belonging there. But we don't name that sense of belonging, right? When you feel good about coming to school or being part of a program. And there's a beginning notion that translanguaging practices, which of course is now very much part of our discourse, that too can be seen through the lens of sense of belonging. So we thought it would be really interesting to think about how do schools construct themselves and run themselves, if you will, to provide students with a sense of belonging as they think about linguistic practices, cultural practices, and which one of those practices support the identity construction of bilingual students. And so for this study, we took a framework that was developed by Bastel and De Cortardi, who looked at the literature on sense of belonging, particularly for children as opposed to for adults. And they identified 4 key components in that literature that was part of a sense of belonging. And the first one is about relationships. That the sense of belonging has a lot to do with the richness of the relationships that you build both with teachers as well as your peers. The other one is the sense of familiarity with place, that you kind of are part of an environment and that this familiarity that you belong to that environment. The third part is what they focus on is agency. And that is the notion that students' sense of belonging is enhanced when they feel that they can contribute to what is happening in their learning environment, and they have a sense of empowerment that they can help shape what happens in that environment. And the last one that they talk about is the sense of inclusion, that belonging has a lot to do with feeling accepted for who you are. And in their model, they kind of contrast that with, when we talk about belonging, there's also always this other dimension of exclusion and non-belonging. So those two pieces come together. So we kind of use that for our study. The study took place in the middle school program, and it's what's called a 50-50 model. Both languages are distributed across all of the subject areas relatively evenly. And because it's a middle school program, it's a separate program, there were actually 2 feeder schools that fed into the program. So it actually 2 different groups of students are coming into the program. And as for those of you who are working with secondary schools, Oftentimes, two-way bilingual programs take in new students as well at the middle school level to, sometimes as a counter to attrition, sometimes it's the only program for the emergent bilingual students coming in. And so this program too had a significant number of students who were essentially newcomers, and that does affect the dynamic. The way that we collected data was both through a survey as well as small group interviews with across the 3 grade levels, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. So we're basically, as we were thinking about relationship, place, and inclusion, we saw that the kind of the themes, if you will, that came through both through the survey as well as our interviews were related to these pieces, and I'll kind of walk you through to each one of them with some examples from our interviews and survey responses. So relationship definitely was very important to the students. That notion of we belong to this program, the teachers care about us was very important for them to have that sense of belonging through care. And definitely the fact that the students, by the time they get to 7th or 8th grade, they've been together since kindergarten or 1st grade. So they know that they are together, they do the same thing and have a similar reference point. And so that becomes a very important source of a sense of belonging as well for them, because they're friends, they're buddies. And they act in many ways more like family than anything else, because they've been doing both elementary and now secondary school together. The sense of place kind of goes along with that, because they've been part of the program. They kind of see this as their normal place to be. It doesn't stand out for them in one way or the other. It's like, well, this is what you do. This is that's our sense of where we belong to. And so being in the program, both at the elementary and middle school level, because we asked them to kind of compare and contrast, really kind of gave them this is the kind of place that we know, that's familiar to us, and we feel good about being part of. One of the things that they talked about, though, that was very different between elementary and middle school is that although they felt very, if you will, sense of belonging within their program, it was a little different the minutes they stepped outside of their program in their middle school. And this is where you can see that the students around them do not have the same awareness around bilingualism. And you can see in this quote that the students definitely feel that they're being looked at in a way that's not embracing, that's not empowering. And as you can see here, they literally say, they just look at us weird because we're talking Spanish. So the minute they step outside of that bubble, there's other discourses and attitudes that they need to negotiate, but their sense of place, therefore, is in the program. The final theme is the inclusion piece, and that one was really expressed through them through the notion of translanguaging. Is the fact that they noticed that the teachers' translanguaging practices included, for example, newcomers. If the instruction was in English and then newcomers were still learning English, the fact that the teacher used both Spanish and English was very much seen as something that ensured that all students felt included. And the students definitely felt that doing translanguaging bilingual practices was kind of what made sense to them as part of their bilingual experiences. And some of them next would say, we want things to learn in both English and in Spanish, not just in one language or the other. So they were definitely putting out a critique of the two solitudes in the programs that we sometimes see. And so they really recognized that as a strategy that was supportive of their peers. The data did not really talk much about the agency part, and this is something that we would love to follow up on in terms of students' sense of feeling that they can kind of influence their environment. So based on kind of our this study, we kind of first of all felt that this notion of sense of belonging is a really important one to pay attention to, and that because of the program identity that continued was pulled in from elementary into middle school, that sense of community became very important for the students and kind of situated them strongly in their secondary program. And given the literature that talks about the disconnect and the loss of engagement for middle school students, sometimes as they move from elementary to secondary, that this becomes a really important piece for students. The translanguaging practices was very important for students, that contributed to the students' sense of belonging. But I also think it's really important to know that even though the two-way bilingual education spaces were safe spaces, it did not necessarily lead to the full integration to the school setting. So when we think about inclusion broader than just belonging to the program, belonging to the school, there's still work to be done. So the two pieces that I kind of walk away with at this juncture in terms of some final thought is that first and foremost, we often talk about classrooms within strands and strands, but we have to also include a whole school's perspective, because these outside pieces also frame the experiences and the identity construction of the students. And then secondly, clearly, we have a lot of work to do in terms of research on secondary two-way programs and the notion of what constitutes culturally sustaining practices and linguistic practices that support students' identity construction. Thank you. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Esther. I'm going to go ahead now and share a video of a panelist who's not able to be with us today, but her paper is represented. This is Sofia Chaparro's paper. Martin and the Pink Crayon, Peer Language Socialization in a Kindergarten Bilingual Classroom.
Deb, can you turn the volume up? It's a little bit hard to hear.
What I argue in this article, given that we only have a short amount of time, I'll share a little bit of where this study took place. This was a study of a two-way immersion Spanish-English bilingual program that was begun as a program within a Philadelphia public school. Importantly, this was within a gentrifying area of the city. And so the first cohort of students that I studied was very diverse in every sense of the way. And the model was a 90-10 model, so that kindergarten was in Spanish. And so within this context, I was very curious to simply understand what happens when you put together kindergartners who come from very different linguistic backgrounds and you put them in a kindergarten classroom that's all in Spanish. And so as somebody that's really interested in classroom interaction, the main question that I sought to ask and answer in this paper is, how do children from diverse cultural, socioeconomic, and linguistic backgrounds interact with each other? What do they learn? And what do they learn through interacting with each other? And so I tried to answer this question by listening to student conversations. I did a lot of audio and video recording of classroom lessons and interactions while I was a participant observer. And I was first in the kindergarten classroom with the first cohort of students, and I followed them to the first grade classroom. And so I did ethnographic participant observation. I also did selected home visits and interviews, but really the bulk of the data for this paper comes from the audio recordings of student interactions. And so quickly, just some of the theoretical and analytical frameworks that undergird my analysis and are important to briefly mention here are understanding language as part of students' communicative repertoires is important. And here in this paper, I also consider language learning a process of language socialization, and therefore second language development as a process of second language socialization. And now within the socialization literature and more broadly linguistic anthropology, identity is conceptualized as something that adheres in habitual social action, right? And so our identity isn't so much on labels, but it's much more on what we do every day as part of our practice or habitual social action. And so this is important for when thinking about what it means to be a bilingual person or a bilingual student, especially from the perspective, right, of a kindergartner. And analytically, the move I make in this paper is that I look at interaction by analyzing and diagramming participation frameworks as the unit of analysis. Now, this comes from Goffman's theories of interaction, who looked at the relationship between speakers and hearers and theorized that really it's much more complicated than just a speaker and a hearer, right? And so he looked at the production formats that a speaker can take on, either animator, author, or principal, and importantly, the participation frameworks of hearers, right? Whether a hearer where a recipient is ratified, and within that, whether that person is addressed or unaddressed, or whether that person is a bystander, just simply happens to overhear something, or is purposely eavesdropping on a conversation, right? And so this really helps us understand the complexity in interaction. And this was critical for understanding and trying to answer my question of what happens when you put children together in this classroom, right? And so I found that diagramming participation, similar to others who have done, such as Clark in '96, I found that it really allowed me to understand the process of peer language socialization in this bilingual classroom. So you see here graphically the different layers of participation, right? Between a speaker and a hearer, and whether hearers are going to be bystanders or overhearers or eavesdroppers, right? And even within that speaker-hearer dyad, you can have other hearers that are perhaps addressed or unaddressed. And so this was critical for answering my question, right? So what happens when you put together diverse groups of children? What do they learn through interacting with each other? And so I'm going to give you a taste of what this looked like in my data. And I chose to diagram interactions visually using diagramming these participation frameworks. So you see the dotted lines, the speakers and the hearers, right? But you see really everybody that's also participating within that interaction. And so just briefly to set the scene, right, these are all kindergartners and they're busy drawing and writing their response to a read aloud they have just heard. And at this table, I joined this table, was Micaela, who is an Italian-American child who came from an English-speaking home. You have Maria, who comes from a Spanish-speaking home, speaks Spanish with mom and dad, and speaks English with her sister. You have Sandy, who speaks mostly Spanish at home, who claims she doesn't know any English. And you had Juan, who comes from a Venezuelan home and speaks both Spanish and English. And so this was Micaela's first experience in a Spanish classroom, and she often claimed she didn't know Spanish. And so she starts off talking to Maria and says, "But you have to ask Lucy if we can have the pink because we don't have one," referring to a pink crayon. "We don't have one?" says Maria. "Nope." "Ah, nosotros teníamos pink," says Sandy. "Tú rompiste este rosado." Right? "We used to have pink and you broke this pink." "Necesito rosado, pero no hay," says Maria. "I need pink, but there isn't any." And so just then, Martin, who was actually at a table adjacent to ours, got up and quietly brought over a pink crayon from his table, smiled, and went back to sit at his table. And so solving the pink crayon problem at this table. And so what this conversation shows, aside from how important pink crayons are in the lives of kindergartners, is that this is a multi-party bilingual conversation happening, where participants have varying levels of proficiency in English and Spanish as part of their repertoires. Yet because they're sitting together, because of their configuration around a table, they're all participating in conversations that occur in both languages. And so even when they're silent observers, right, students are being socialized as participants into conversations that expand their communicative abilities in their lesser known language, right? So for example, when Sandy, right, participates quietly in the conversation between Micaela and Maria that happened in English around the missing pink crayon, which she adds to in Spanish, commenting on they used to have pink, but it broke, right? And in turn, Micaela, who claims she doesn't understand Spanish, is able to listen to Sandy's comments, right? And so I argue that they're silent participants in these conversations that are occurring in both languages. And so constantly being motivated as these participants in bilingual conversations means that every day they participate in bilingual conversations, right? And if our identity inheres in our habitual social activity, we're habitually participating in bilingual conversations means that these students are actually bilingual students, right? Because they're participating in bilingual conversations. And so this is just one data point that I show in my article. There's a second one that's a little bit more complicated that shows both implicit and explicit second language socialization. So I invite you to read it. Here, suffice it to say that given classroom configurations, you can see how this happens constantly, right? How students are participating in conversations in different languages and how they're overhearing and participating in them all throughout the day. And so I just want to go over a couple of the findings, right, that came from this analysis. First, children are constantly going in and out of each other's conversations. And because they're so close to each other, even when they're not the addressed recipients of utterances, they're being ratified as participants in conversations that transpire in different languages and modalities. And simply by their physical positioning at their tables, right, during whole group or small group lessons, children are motivated as participants in conversations that occur in languages which maybe they can't yet produce utterances, right? But they start to begin to at least participate in those conversations. And to bring it home, really, I argue that these moments of second language socialization occur in everyday interactions among children and unmediated classroom talk, even when children are silent observers, right? And this happens because of their intentional spatial positioning, right? And finally, this occurs even when children are less aware, resist, or reject their emerging bilingual proficiency. Finally, this framework that I present here of visually diagramming conversations allows us to see how participation influences the course of interaction and how speakers and hearers together negotiate communication. It provides just a snapshot into the moments that I argue over time constitute second language development through peer socialization. And so again, thank you so much for your time. I invite questions and comments to my email, and thank you again.
Thank you. Our next presenter is Suzanne. Go ahead.
Thank you, Deb. Let me share my screen. Okay, can everybody hear me? Okay, so I'm Suzanne Garcia Mateus. I'm an assistant professor and the director of Miel at CSUMB, or CSU Monterey Bay in California. The title of my presentation is Bilingual Student Perspectives about Language Expertise in a Gentrifying Two-Way Immersion Program. So this, as many of you know, the two-way immersion model uses language labels around the classroom for different purposes. In this paper, I'm thinking about language labels as they were used in this program to identify students as speakers of Spanish or speakers of English. I also consider the ways in which the idea of a language expert transpired during my individual student interviews. And I'll share more a little bit about the context next. One of my main goals was to understand the ways in which students were being perceived by their peers and classroom teachers as language learners, in order to understand how power relations were operated as the school demographics were changing in the setting, and it was changing quite drastically and quickly. So I'm drawing from the Raciolinguistic perspective, and as coded here, I considered the ways or how Raciolinguistic ideologies produce racialized speaking subjects who are constructed as linguistically deviant. When I was going through my data, one of the ways I decided to approach it, and I'll explain why, was to explore how the racialization processes of students by examining students' understanding of the use of language labels and how they reinforce the notion of language experts in this particular classroom. So my research questions are, how do students understand the role that language labels play in a two-way immersion classroom? And how do language labels position students in this particular classroom? So this data comes from a larger study. I followed a cohort of students from kindergarten through third grade. The paper that I wrote for this presentation focuses on the second grade year. And for today's presentation, I'm focusing on 4 students. If you would like to know more about the teacher interviews, I invite you to read the paper. during the student interviews, one of my main goals was to get an idea of how the students were seeing themselves or possibly not seeing themselves as bilingual students. I was really trying to compliment them on their journey in this program since they were now in the second grade year. So during my interviews with them in second grade, they saw videos of themselves in kindergarten, first grade, and second grade. So in the following slides, what I'll do is talk about my findings through the 4 students and the conversations that we had, which also are findings. So Nico, he came from an upper middle class background. His mother was from Latin America and his father was white. They both spoke Spanish. And it was through this interview with Nico that I realized that he really like kind of laid out the raciolinguistic hierarchy in the classroom by the way he and others were talking about each other. And so he referred to himself as a pro Spanish speaker, a pro bilingual. And what he was doing is really talking about other students like himself that came from this upper middle class background. And that really spoke to me because it was really describing how the use of the academic register in English and Spanish were highly valued. And then he would talk about, along with other classmates, Spanish speakers as being from Mexico. And some of the teachers would even refer to them as students who were social bilinguals. And so it was from this interview that I kind of shifted in thinking about the analysis of the other interviews and thinking about how language, class, and race intersected and afforded certain students a sort of cultural and linguistic capital in English and Spanish. So the second finding was based on Elizabeth, and she comes from a working class background. Her mother only spoke Spanish. She started this two-way immersion program at the same time as Nico in kindergarten. She started speaking Spanish, but by the time I interviewed her in second grade, she was translating, doing all these great dynamic things with her bilingualism. What I found interesting is that many students like Elizabeth were positioned a certain way, and this quote here really speaks to that. This is her teacher, and she says, "Elizabeth is a Spanish speaker. But I mean, if you talk to Elizabeth, she's kind of not all there sometimes." So this is just one quote, but there were others, and including her classmates would talk about her from a deficit perspective. But what I found particularly interesting and empowering, and something that Elizabeth taught me, was that even at a second grader or someone that's 7 or 8 years old can really resist these sort of dominant perspectives about her own bilingualism and about her classmates' bilingualism, in particular Cristobal, who I'll talk about later, despite being described as someone that didn't know either Spanish or English. And so I thought that was pretty powerful and amazing that she could do that. And the one thing I walked away with through talking to students like Elizabeth is that we really need to listen to children and listen to what they're saying and think about what they're saying in the particular context that they're saying it in. In this particular context, it was a gentrifying two-way immersion program. So the next student is Tessa, and I've titled this finding "The Unmarked Label, a White Student's Perspective." So Tessa came from an English-speaking home. Her parents identified as white, but she had been learning Spanish since she was a baby. She was in a Spanish immersion daycare. And what was interesting about her, and through my interview with her, what I learned is that she was very aware of these programmatic labels that were being used in the classroom. She herself was technically the Spanish expert, and her partner, Cristobal, who was Latinx, was considered the English expert. But what she said to me was that she actually knows that Cristobal is bilingual and knows just a tiny bit more Spanish than her. But what she didn't realize, and again, she's 7 or 8 years old, is that she carried this unmarked white label, right? That meant that she had this white privilege in speaking Spanish, and she didn't fully recognize that, and we don't expect her to at such a young age. But I argue that young children can have these conversations if they're presented with them in the classroom in different ways. And this is important because if we don't, then we risk further marginalizing students of color and their use of Spanish and their bilingualism in in deficit ways if we don't, you know, take steps to actually break down these social inequities and talk about them in the classroom. So the last student, or the last finding, is Cristobal. And Cristobal was Tejano or Chicano. He was bilingual, and he came from a bilingual home. But this was his first year in this two-way immersion program. And what I found interesting about Cristobal, you know, he, as I mentioned earlier, he was pegged the English speaker in a bilingual pair. But he really disrupted a raciolinguistic agenda. And I say this because despite being, you know, positioned as the English speaker in this pair, he used Spanish, and he says that he taught, you know, he helped Tessa with Spanish and that she helped him with English. But what was interesting is that his Spanish, or his bilingualism, was essentially erased by this public institution, unlike Tessa's. So one of the final things I want to say just about Cristobal and all of the students in this paper is that the labels that were being used, the language labels that were being used, weren't accurate representations of their actual abilities and their linguistic identities. So to conclude, there's an urgent call for scholars and practitioners to really reimagine the design of the two-way immersion model. We need to reconsider the ways in which perception plays a role and how teachers position students, because they set the tone for how students position each other and how they understand the use of language labels. We also need to rethink the goals of the two-way immersion model, and many scholars are already doing that. But we need to expand it into our schools and really shift the way we think about the goals of two-way immersion, because we need to make sure that we're meeting the needs of the students that the bilingual education was intended to serve. Raciolinguistic theory can also shift practitioners' perspectives. This is especially important in those pre-service teacher education programs before they go into the classroom, so that they can start thinking about the Latinx students' use of Spanish and bilingualism in, you know, rich, dynamic, and flexible ways. Part of this is because I also think that we need to, and teacher education programs should include how teachers both can be very powerful agents, because they can both mitigate and shift power relations in these culturally, ethnically, and linguistically diverse contexts. Thank you. This concludes my presentation.
All right. Thank you, Suzanne. I think I'm up next. Share my screen. Okay. So hello again. Again, I'm Laura Hammond-Ortiz, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Colorado Boulder. Today, I'm going to be sharing the presentation based on the article I contributed to the special issue, which is called Becoming Bilingual in Two-Way Immersion, Patterns of Investment in a Second Grade Classroom. And so my goal in this article was to critically examine how young students were experiencing and making sense of their emerging bilingualism. And while there has been increasing attention to what it means to integrate languages in these spaces, there hasn't been as much attention to what it means to integrate students in these spaces, as some of the previous papers have spoken to as well. And so I really wanted to understand the similarities and differences between how Latinx and non-Latinx students in this classroom were making sense of their emerging bilingualism, and really ground this understanding in a situated look at the classroom context. So thinking about the ideologies and practices within the classroom that were shaping the way students were coming to make sense of their bilingualism. And the theoretical framework that I used to ground this article is Bonnie Norton's notion of investment. So Bonnie Norton introduced this idea in the mid-1990s as a way to acknowledge the important role of identity in second language learning. And the term investment is meant to be a sociological reframing of the term motivation. And so she articulates it, she says, unlike the more traditional notions of motivation, which often conceive of the language learner as having a unitary, fixed, and ahistorical personality, the construct of investment conceives of the language learner as having a complex identity, changing across time and space and reproduced in social interaction. And so this idea of asking if students are, whether or not students are invested in learning a language helps us to more explicitly consider who students are and who they hope to become through the process of learning a language, the ideological and contextual factors that are shaping student learning. So recognizing that learning isn't just happening within the student's head, but that the classroom itself, the learning context shapes how and why students invest in learning a new language. And then the symbolic or material resources, or what Bourdieu referred to as capital, that students anticipate obtaining as a result of learning that language. In 2015, Bonnie Norton and her student Ron Darvin released an expanded model of this theory, of this framework, that sought to more explicitly look at the intersections between these different components, and also to think about the role of systemic patterns of control in shaping students' investments. So looking at the affordances or perceived benefits that students viewed that they would obtain as a result of learning a language, how they position themselves and others, and then the different patterns of control that shape how and why students invest in language learning. And to this model, I propose adding spaces of resistance to also look at not only the patterns of control that limit how students might be able to engage in language learning, but also the ways that teachers and students have agency in resisting some of these patterns of control. So I use this framework both as a theoretical and as an analytical tool in looking at the ways that students in the second grade classroom were coming to understand their own bilingualism and that of their peers. And so the three questions that I ask in this article are, how do students in a second grade 2A immersion classroom make sense of becoming bilingual? What shapes their investment in this process? And what are the similarities and differences in how Latinx and non-Latinx students experience their emerging bilingualism? And just to give you a little bit of the context, I go into much more detail within the paper itself, but it's a year-long ethnographic case study of languaging and identity negotiation in a second grade 2A immersion classroom. And this took place in an elementary school with a Spanish-English 2A immersion program in a Midwestern city. And in this context, there was a growing Latinx student population, but many of the students who were participating in the 2A immersion programs in this city were white, English dominant, or English monolingual students who were entering these bilingual programs. In this particular classroom, there were 17 students, 11 of whom were designated as native English speakers, and 6 were designated as the native Spanish speakers. And like Suzanne, I think it's important that we problematize these labels, but recognizing that they exist in these programs, but aren't full representations of students' complex linguistic identities. All right, so I wanted to, since we have a limited time, I wanted to just focus on some of the findings from this study. In this study, most of my data sources came from student interviews, although I also, as I mentioned, it was a year-long ethnographic study, have field notes from classroom observations and teacher interviews that I used to gain a deeper understanding of how student sense making was interconnecting with the context that they were learning within. So I want to begin by sharing some of the similarities I saw in the interviews and the focus groups that I did with students around how they were making sense of bilingualism. First, in looking at how they were positioning themselves and others, students largely were developing really positive views of bilingualism and their bilingual identities. For example, one student, Francisco, said, aprender bilingüe es mucho mejor que aprender un idioma. It's much better to learn bilingually than to learn just one language. Matthew said it's fun because you get to communicate differently. So students in this classroom were really developing bilingual identities of competence, to use Maniac's term. So really developing these positive understandings of themselves as bilingual learners. Another thing that came up when students were talking about why they wanted to become bilingual was this ideology of becoming citizens of the world. And this is something that came up from students regardless of their home language background or home language experiences. So students talked about being able to travel. So Emma said, when I get older, I want to be able to learn a bunch of languages and travel around the world so you could talk to people and try new stuff. And students also talked about language learning beyond Spanish and English. Tomas mentioned that he knew Portuguese, even though he just knew a few words like, oi, como estai? Hello, how are you? But students were beginning to take on these bi or multilingual identities and see those identities as a way to become citizens of the world. Something that was really interesting about this finding, or this particular way that students were investing in their bilingualism, is that even students who had never traveled or who didn't have family in other countries that they were regularly talking with or visiting still shared this understanding. So Tiana, for example, had never traveled outside of the United States. And yet when she was talking about why she wanted to become bilingual, she said, if you go on a trip to Mexico and someone says something to you in Spanish and your family doesn't know what they're saying, then how are you going to communicate with them? And this came up from a few students who didn't have experiences traveling to other places, or like I said, interacting with families in other places. So this goes back to Bonnie Norton's idea of imagined identities, that even students who weren't directly experiencing these things were projecting these understandings of their future selves as citizens of the world, as part of the reason why they were investing in becoming bilingual. But in the data, I also found many ways that there were differences in the patterns of investment between how Latinx students were coming to understand bilingualism and why they wanted to become bilingual, and their non-Latinx peers. So for example, in terms of perceived benefits or affordances, many of the students talked about increasing their employment opportunities, which I found interesting given that they were second grade students, that they were already thinking about bilingualism as a way to how it might impact their future careers, which perhaps was from a larger discourse they were hearing from parents or from the teacher. So Mia, for example, said, we could grow up to become teachers that are bilingual, and then we could help students. And Tomás shared, necesitas otro idioma cuando crezcas porque estás en un país que habla otro idioma que tú sabes. You need to learn another language when you grow up because you're in a country that knows a different language than you, that uses a different language than you know. And what was interesting about the ways that students were talking about this, perceived benefit was the framing of these ideas in terms of their modality. So non-Latinx students largely talked about bilingualism as something that would be nice to have for future employment. We could grow up to become teachers, something optional. Whereas when Latinx students were talking about bilingualism, they use stronger modals like necesitas, you need. So seeing bilingualism not as an option, but as a requirement for their future employment opportunities. Another interesting thing that came up in the data that showed a clear difference between Latinx and non-Latinx students was the way that they were positioning themselves and others in relation to their bilingualism. And this is a term that I call, or an idea that came up that I term bilingual exceptionalism. So for example, non-Latinx students often talked about how bilingualism was something that made them feel special or something that was really unique. Noah said, it makes me feel kind of special because not everyone knows how to speak two languages. So there was really an idea of bilingualism as something different than the norm. Whereas when I talked to the Latinx students about bilingualism, many of the times they didn't even understand why I was asking the question, or they talked about bilingualism as just being a very normal thing. So in this conversation I had with Jose, I asked him what it was like to learn in a bilingual class. And he asked me a bilingual class. And I said, you're learning in a bilingual class, what's it like? And he said, me siento normal, I feel normal. And I asked why, and he said, porque sé bien las cosas, unas palabras en inglés y español. I know things, some things in Spanish, some things in English. And so this idea that bilingualism was something unique or special didn't really come up in my conversations with Latinx students. It was just their lived reality. And I don't have time to go deep into the data around systemic patterns of control and spaces of resistance, but it's important to recognize that these ideologies in many ways were being reinforced by the existing by the classroom, by the existing institutional structures. So there were, within the school and within the classroom, there were systemic patterns of control that were centering English and English speakers. And one that was particularly salient was the practice of affirmation. And this is something that the teacher did with all the best intentions in order to keep students using Spanish. She would often celebrate extensively the Spanish use of non-Latinx students when they did engage in Spanish and use Spanish, even if it was just a couple of words, in a way that the English use of Latinx students wasn't celebrated. And so even though this practice was meant to create a Spanish space, it often fostered some of this bilingual exceptionalism of the white non-Latinx students, because she was constantly celebrating their use of Spanish in the classroom. And in the school, English was a language that was assessed. There weren't any regular assessments or standardized assessments of Spanish. So a few of the practices that were continuing to center English and English speakers, even in a school that really was aimed at centering the Latinx community. But I also found that there were ways that the teacher was resisting these ideologies and really working hard to create a space that privileged Spanish. In her curriculum, she centered Latinx cultures and experiences. She often talked about about her own experiences as a Mexican-American woman, and brought those experiences into the curriculum. And so that in of itself, I think, also fostered investment in becoming bilingual. So we can see some of the ways that the context shaped both bilingual exceptionalism and this shared understanding and shared excitement around bilingualism for all students. All right, so just a few implications. And again, this is brief, so I encourage you to look at the paper if you want to see a little bit more of the data and how students were making sense of these experiences. But I've in my work as a teacher educator and as a researcher, I often encounter the sponge metaphor, which some of you may know as well, or have heard as well, talking about young children as if they're little sponges who absorb language so quickly. And that's why it's so important to get them in these programs when they're young. And I think it's important that we begin to rethink this metaphor, because it can lead us to believe that 2A immersion students are not actively making sense of bilingualism. And when the opposite is true, they're constantly thinking about their bilingualism, and they're deeply cognizant of the ways that languages, as Bakhtin put it, live a real life. They know they're grappling with language ideologies and questions around language from an early age. And so I think referring to them as these kind of neutral sponges just absorbing language doesn't allow us to think about them as agentive beings. I also think it's important that we attend to pattern differences in the sense-making and experiences of Latinx and non-Latinx students. Students are entering these programs with different understandings of what bilingualism is and different understandings of what their goals for becoming bilingual are. And so we need to think about that if we want to design more equity-oriented programs. And finally, the need to continually interrogate systemic patterns of control that are privileging majority languages and speakers in 2A bilingual programs. So even schools that may be doing this unintentionally, I think need to take a step back and think critically about the ways that the programs might be set up to be reinforcing some of the same structures that they're trying to combat. And so that is all for today. And here's some of the references, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for this opportunity to present. I'm April Salerno, and I'm joined today by my co-authors, Amanda Kibler and Christine Hardigree. For the sake of time, I'll be presenting on behalf of the three of us, and they'll join in during the Q&A. So our work is situated within what we see as a tension that dual language spaces can both reify marginalized identities, but also can support ethno-linguistic identities. And in the data that I'll show you today from our study, we see kind of both of these things happening. Our work is set within an extracurricular high school dual language program in Spanish and English. We're focused on the interactions between one pair working within a small group. And these students are collaboratively writing a bilingual storybook that they are intending to present to elementary bilingual learners in their same school system. We view the data through a framework of exploratory talk and positionality frames. Our research question was, how do adolescents in an ethno-linguistically diverse bilingual group use exploratory talk to both negotiate intersectional identities and move forward the academic work of collaborative bilingual writing? The participants that we focus on today include Emily. Emily's an Asian female. She's in 11th grade. English is her home community language, and she began taking Spanish classes when she was in the 6th grade. She was adopted from China as an infant. Javier is working with Emily to co-write the bilingual story that they're working on. He's a Latinx male in 10th grade. His Spanish is his home community language, and he immigrated from Honduras at the age of 9. He's also a very successful varsity soccer player at the school, and you'll see him reference that identity within the data we look at. There were 4 teachers facilitating the program and assisting students with their work, and we as researchers also took an active role in the program, helping to organize activities. So this is excerpt 1 that we'll look at. Here in this excerpt, Emily and Javier are working to pick the characters of who will be in their bilingual story. And so they're having sort of a playful teasing sort of conversation back and forth. And Javier makes the suggestion of, yeah, I'll be the hero. And he's saying, just run with it, right? And he's wearing his varsity athletic jacket. And he says, I have the Hamilton. Hamilton is the pseudonym that we use for the high school. And he points to the letter H on his jacket and the horse mascot. And he says, I'll be the hero and I'll ride the horse. And he makes sort of a galloping and then lasso twirling kind of gesture. And Emily, in this playful manner, she's laughing. She says, oh God. And he says, no, I'll be amazing. And Emily's like, I know, yeah, cowboys. And she kind of seizes on the gesture that he makes. And Javier says, I'm a cowboy. And she's like, no. And then he says, for real, I'm a cowboy. So here, Javier lays claim to this hero and cowboy identity, both inside the narrative and in real life. And we see this kind of thing going back and forth between their story writing and their real life identities kind of across the data. Emily here temporarily rejects his claim to this identity, but later in the data, she relents. Now we're going to look at excerpt 2, which is a little bit different. So in excerpt 2, they are, the two students are going back and forth over whose turn it should be to, or who should write the ideas down on their paper. They're talking in English, but they're writing the work in Spanish. So this is important. And Emily is saying to Javier, it's your turn. She's been writing and she wants to hand the paper off to him. Javier says, I don't know how to write it. And Emily says, you're wasting time. She points to her watch. And Javier says, I don't know how to write it. I'm being serious. He puts emphasis on serious, that he doesn't know. And he's saying, if I knew how to write it, I would do it. I don't know how. Emily says, okay, fine. I'll get, and she has this idea as a suggestion. She says, I'll give it to you in Spanish and then you have to write it. And he's like, in English? And she's like, in Spanish. And then he's saying again, no, I don't know how to write it. I don't know how to write it in Spanish. And in this excerpt, Emily positions Javier as the scribe, saying it's your turn to write. Javier, we know outside of this event that Javier told us in other times that he regretted personally not having more opportunities to develop his Spanish literacy. And so we take his claim that he cannot write it in Spanish seriously, while Emily seems to reject that and instead says that he's wasting time pointing to her watch. And we'll have a little bit of interpretation on the next slide of some more of what we think is going on here. So there are several things going on. There are a host of identities under negotiation in the transcripts we examined. Many of these are micro local level identities, both in the real world, such as student in the program and in the narrative, cowboy, hero, and sometimes these things go back and forth from the narrative to real life. The two-way immersion idea of experts here, we see that this might be setting up expectations that students have mirrored skills. So we believe in that second excerpt, Emily might be expecting that Javier has the same sort of literacy skills that she has in English, that he has those in Spanish. And so if she gives it to him in Spanish, then he would be able to write it in Spanish. And we see on Javier's end that that's not the case. And so those expectations are setting up some tension between the two of them. We explore in our paper the idea that many adolescents take part in these programs because they have a strong interest in educational equity and social justice issues. And that we believe it's important to engage adolescents directly in conversations about these programs and in the roles and identities that the programs might place upon them and how they can help support each other in having access to a full range of identities that they might wish to espouse. So that's the end of our presentation, and I look forward to your questions.
Good morning or good afternoon to everybody. I'm Catherine Mortimer.
And I'm Gabriela Dolza.
And let me try sharing my screen again. There we go. Does that look good, Gabby?
It does, yeah.
Okay. So in this paper, we'd like to highlight some ways that Latinx high school dual language students conceptualize themselves and their peers and their bilingualism in ways that contrasted significantly with some of the dichotomizing ways that we often identify students in school and their languaging in practice. So they were using ways that were much more in line with conceptual trends in the field towards holistic and dynamic bilingualism.
So the dual language program at Montañero High School was one of the few dual language programs at the high school level in the Ocotillo School District on the US-Mexico border. This program offered dual language classes such as biology, US history, and business, which were presented as classes delivered all in Spanish, even though translanguaging practices were used to teach and among students and teachers' interactions. Most dual language students had participated in dual language programs at the elementary and middle school levels. Most of them had also exceeded the category of English learner by the time they arrived at high school. There were very few students who participated in the program that continued to hold the institutional label of English learner, and even fewer newcomers who mostly came from Ciudad Juarez. This ethnographic work focuses on how students identify themselves and conceptualize their language use. We relate this self-identification to two larger phenomena: practical exclusion and conceptual inclusion. Practical exclusion refers to two things: general labeling practices that are dichotomizing, like English learner or non-English learner, and also in our context, to a recent district policy shifts saying that students labeled as English learners should not enroll in dual language classes. The policy said that they should be placed in English as a second language instruction instead. This practical exclusion, however, differed from the way students conceptualize themselves and their language uses. Their holistic and dynamic ways of bilingualism reflected the trend in our field toward conceptually inclusive, translanguaging ways of thinking about language and language users, defined dichotomous labels based on English proficiency. A way dual language students located themselves and their peers in a more general and inclusive category was through the use of person deictics, as in this example from an interview with Efrain, who had lived in El Paso all his life and was not therefore someone we thought of as a newcomer. When I asked Efrain if he would recommend the dual language program for newcomers, he started by referring to the hypothetical newcomers in the third person. Oh, sí, claro, les recomendaría. But then he shifted to an impersonal you or tú to say, empezarías con español para poder sentirte fuerte y expandir tu lenguaje y tu vocabulario. This change in pronouns from the third to second person shifted the construction of newcomers' experience as theirs and not Ephraim's, to him constructing it as general and shared. He could be a newcomer, I could be a newcomer, or anyone else. Despite school dichotomies and even our own perceptions that newcomers and students like Efrain were significantly different, he and his peers identified themselves with a single category.
So in addition to conceptualizing themselves within a more inclusive and non-dichotomous single category of language learners and users, students also consistently described their language use and ideal classroom language, not in terms of how a particular named language should be used, but rather in terms of comprehension, or what was most understandable, most meaningful at that time. So Jorge was a long-term dual language participant, and he felt very comfortable in English. And he, like some of his peers that we also interviewed, argued that his teacher's translanguaging was important for his learning of academic vocabulary, or what he called palabras más extravagantes o de calidad. He explained that his teacher's translanguaging practices helped him to see more connections. He also said that if dual credit and AP classes employed translanguaging, more of his peers would sign up for them. Other students identified translanguaging as ensuring their participation in class. So they felt like when translanguaging was used and an important practice in their classroom, they had no excuses not to participate, and indeed participated more. So while adults conceptualized bilingualism primarily in terms of language proficiency, students were constructing a bilingualism that was far more about meaning making and the academic and interactional goals of understanding content, understanding the teacher and other people, and about participating in learning and advanced coursework. The youth in our study located themselves along a single languaging continuum and within a single inclusive category of language learners and users, very unlike the dichotomous framings that adults used for both people and language use. For them, for the students, language proficiency was decidedly non-hierarchical and importantly, continuously emergent. A framing that's much in line with Nelson Flores's proposal that we see people as simply lingual. We argue that the idea of bilingualism as continuously emergent is especially important in the secondary levels where many students' bilingual repertoires may be extensively developed, and teachers may overlook opportunities for ongoing language development and for using bilingual instruction to facilitate participation and access to advanced coursework, AP classes, dual credit coursework, and also, of course, for building an culturally inclusive, linguistically inclusive learning community for youth. A continuously emergent view of bilingualism also, like these students had, also normalizes the locations of all students along a single continuum and makes exclusionary policies like those we saw less logical. The idea that bilingualism is dynamic and emergent at the beginning of the continuum has definitely taken hold and is growing, but the idea that its emergence continues indefinitely thereafter is still much less apparent in practice and is much needed especially as dual language instruction gains ground in high school and after. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank everybody for your presentations. This leaves us with just about 15 minutes for questions and answers. And while the attendees are putting together your questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A box that is a separate box. I have a couple of thoughts to offer, and there have been some thoughts as well in the chat, but I wanted to look across the special issue to kind of ask the question, what if we understand two-way bilingual education as a space for students to explore and take up new identities? What if that's what it is, right? Because we really can think of them as experimental spaces for new identities to play. Identities that challenge kids, that uplift kids, that are chosen by them or chosen for them. Identities that are highly valued, and at times identities that are resisting the status quo. And there are three, I think, cross-sectional takeaways. There's a lot more actually, but I'm going to talk about three real briefly. First, students are clearly agentic across all ages, from Sophia's kindergartners all the way to the 12th graders on the border. They're agentively constructing opportunities for themselves to occupy these complex identities of their construction, right? Second, students' co-construction of new identities coincides with, and I would say it's even inextricable from, their efforts to master new language practices in these two-way bilingual programs. And finally, I think complex intersectional identities just insist upon emerging, despite educators and programs at times puzzling efforts to assert binaries onto the programs or to the students themselves. So what questions do you all have, either panelists for each other or attendees?
You know, Deb, if I may, I love the fact that we think about two-way bilingual programs as spaces where identities can be explored in different ways. And I wonder in what ways we bring intersectionality into our conversations then, because we tend to still focus a lot on language, or culture, but I'm thinking gender, I'm thinking sexuality, I'm thinking all the ways that these identities also emerge. And I wonder in what ways do we capture that then as part of our research?
I'd rather not be the one to answer. Who's got some ideas? Researchers.
I think I can simply say that this is exactly what came out in our data. As we were trying to understand positioning, we realized how limited we were when we were only thinking about the language-based labels, because for our one student, his soccer playing identity, way more important than most other identities he was trying to put forth in this setting. And so we just found that once you dive into the real world of these interactions, you can't ignore them and actually understand what's going on, because there's just simply too much at play. So I think for researchers, and is continuing to go to, and I think that's what so much of this great data shows, is look at the interactional data, look at students talking to each other, and you do see some of these things. Yeah, as you said, that we can't help but see them.
I can respond to that also. When I started this research, which was, for 4 years, I did start, Esther, with language, focusing on language. And by the second year of data collection, I realized that there's so much more. There's so many more like important things when it comes to, let's just say, translanguaging, right? And it's that sociopolitical piece of it, and now the critical consciousness piece of it. And most recently, I feel like I'm focusing less on language and more of what that other piece, right? And then just to finish my comment, I did see a lot of room for gender identity examination in my data because of the way girls and boys were being positioned in the classroom and interacting with one another. And I kind of regret not exploring that more. So I do think there's definitely a need for that in these, diverse contexts.
I would add also that we saw ways that gender identities were being placed upon the students as well, in those identities that the students were wanting to take up as narratives. Even they had heard from the elementary school students about their interests in readings, and they were very gender segregated, if you will, with girls saying they wanted to hear stories about princesses and boys saying they wanted to hear about superheroes. And that carried through into the conversations that we saw from the adolescents in their story planning about who the characters would be. And the idea that Javier is going to be the hero would be a masculinized identity that we saw even coming from the elementary students they were communicating with.
So we have a really interesting question on the Q&A panel. If any of you have been able to bring these conversations, particularly with ratiolinguistic implications, up with the teachers in the classrooms that you worked with. So back to practice kind of question.
Do they mean like recently or at all, like just in general?
I would say it all, if that was part of the project,
I keep thinking about the first grade teacher I worked with. She, I mean, at the time, ratiolinguistic theory wasn't, something that we talked about in academia at that time, but we definitely talked around those related topics, right? And she really kind of embraced talking about race in the classroom and documented immigration, and all those topics. But she was probably the only one in the 4 teachers that I worked with. And we did it through children's literature. That's the piece I wanted to add, that children's multicultural, multilingual children's literature really lends itself to those kinds of discussions in the classroom.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that too. Yeah, I do think, so in the research I was presenting, some of the findings as they were emerging, I talked about with the classroom teacher, and particularly the finding around bilingual exceptionalism. And one thing that was interesting as I was talking to the teacher about, and this was more about the classroom practice, more so than the students themselves, coming to see their bilingualism as exceptional or as normal everyday activity. But one of the interesting things that we talked about was just how difficult it is as a teacher to not reinforce bilingual exceptionalism. And it's something that I think I'm still trying to think through too, in the work that I do supporting teachers in these programs, because in order to maintain a Spanish space for her students and to really privilege Spanish, she did constantly affirm the largely white English dominant students for their use of Spanish. And it was a way that she could keep that space a Spanish space. And so in doing so, and in not doing the opposite and not affirming English use, because English students didn't need to be told to use English. They just used English when it was English time, regardless of their home language practices. And so in trying to combat some of the hegemony of English, she was in some ways reinforcing this idea of bilingual exceptionalism. And we talked about it. And I think in having conversations about it, it's helpful to become just aware of that. And she started working at kind of shifting her own practice a little bit, but I don't think there's an easy answer always, and even how to address these intersections of language and race and power. And so, yes, it's something I think it's important to make sure that we do as scholars, as we continue to bring these findings back to the teachers we're working with.
So there's a sort of pairing of questions that's come up. Two people are wondering, first about making a space in dual language. Sarah Hessen asks, something I've been thinking about is how to make a space in dual language bilingual programs to explicitly talk about language and identity with students and to explore what it means to be going to a bilingual school. So would anyone like to speak to a vision for what that space could look like? Or do you know of a school that has integrated a space like this into the school day? And to go with that, there's also a question about teacher preparation and getting space to talk with teachers in teacher preparation spaces about these same issues.
I'll take a stab at that. You know, I think that if I had this to do over again, I would because we were taking an active role also in helping planning the program. I think that we would have really addressed these issues of identity and with the students. I think we talked a lot with them about what they wanted the program to look like, but I don't think we talked about identity and what kind of spaces it should have for them to develop those within that, and to directly confront the idea of what does it mean that we place on people to be an English expert or a Spanish expert, and how could we problematize that with the students themselves directly. And I think that we would probably be really delighted and surprised to see the sophistication with which they would take up that conversation.
In the larger study that I referenced earlier, one of the teachers used children's literature to do this. And so she was able to engage in conversations, like I mentioned, about undocumented immigration, but also about what it means to use Spanish and English. She focused on phonemic awareness through the use of poems, through bilingual poems, for example. And the students really engaged in some great conversation. One student actually, who's very quiet, took it upon himself to kind of correct the way the class was saying his name. They were calling him Jose instead of Jose, and he explained that there's an accent on the E. And so I saw potential there, and I try to do that now in my own classrooms. With pre-service teachers, we bring in children's literature and we have these kinds of conversations just to model what they could do with students in the classroom.
I guess along those same lines, both in the study Suzanne's talking about and in pre-service teacher education, I've seen the use of drama and reenactment being a super powerful tool for getting students to put themselves in others' shoes and to think critically about problem solving and about identities as they sort of literally take up new identities in the action of it. And in the elementary classroom, we did a study with process drama with children's literature as the sort of stage. And then in the pre-service teacher classroom, I'm also putting students who are future teachers into the roles of teachers, tackling different kinds of problems in different kinds of situations.
Yeah, and just to add one more idea, I do think it's really important to kind of think outside of conversations too, especially with young learners. I found that when I was interviewing the second graders about bilingualism, I often got very straightforward single sentence responses about like bilingualism is speaking Spanish and English. But one thing I did in the second part of, in the larger study, the second part of my study was had students create language portraits. And if that's not something you're familiar with, you should check it out, Google it now. It's like basically giving students a silhouette of a body and having them map where their languages would fit into the different parts of their body, kind of metaphorically. And it was a really powerful way for students to speak or to show themselves more holistically. And the way I love how in Catherine's article, you talk about like more expansive, linguistically expansive understandings of students. And it was just a way to visually see how students were thinking about their lingual identities. And some drew like they split their body in half and they showed half Spanish, half English, very much showing the way the program was framing them. And others had much more dynamic ways of representing their lingual identities. So it's a powerful way, especially with young students, to talk about bilingualism.
I've done that with practicing teachers in professional developments as well. It's great for all ages and in all situations to open up your perspectives about what it means to be bi or multilingual and to carry different identities. So one last question I think we have time for, maybe before the end. And somebody was particularly interested in the fact, Megan Trenda asks, so wonderful to see and hear about findings focused on the secondary bilingual student. So where do you see the greatest need moving forward in research around adolescents in bilingual programs? And I will just say, I do think that's one of the unique things about this issue is that we are balanced in terms of representation of secondary students, not just younger students, as tends to happen in bilingual ed. So those 3 papers, what do you all think?
I think I'm constantly thinking about what is it about dual language education in the secondary, in high schools in particular, like upper secondary, that might be different about what we generally accept as true, partly because most of that research has been done on elementary levels. And I keep asking myself this question because we run into things in our study where we think, oh wait, maybe this is because most of what we have learned and have studied and have focused on, we didn't think about it as being about elementary kids and initial literacy, but it was about elementary kids and initial literacy. That wasn't the focus of it. The focus was dual language. And so much of what I have accepted in my sort of head of as being about dual language really is, I notice more and more in studying the secondary level, there is something that perhaps is specific to initial literacy or to children who are earlier on in just being language users of any kind. And so the students at the secondary level that were sharing their lives with us taught us many things about why things that we had accepted, like something like that they would consider themselves different, for example, from students who were not participating in the dual language program. And they actually didn't. They didn't see themselves as different. And that they didn't really care as much about being expert Spanish speakers or expert English speakers as much as they cared about having access to AP curriculum, and they cared about being good at biology, or they cared about being able to do business and do it in the languages that they had been learning in. And so I'm just really interested in asking those questions about what might be different about the secondary level that just because of that sort of underrepresentation in the literature.
I think Catherine's, I think that's a great way of framing that. I think one of the things too that we were saying is that the investment in learning and using both languages for the adolescents is just very different. And so to think about what that means, and particularly I think what that means in terms of curriculum, and how we connect maybe what we do in the program with, for example, community service learning kinds of projects. When we did the study earlier, the students were basically, we just want to use Spanish. You know, this is no longer for them about learning the language. It's like they know that it's something you want to use and that you can use for multiple purposes. And so they were really looking for relevance for them. And I think what's relevant for adolescents is very different than what's relevant for first or second graders. So I think that piece, I totally agree, I think is huge. I think the other piece I'm just really curious about, therefore, is, so what does the trajectory over time look like? You know, if we were to trace students from elementary into middle into high school, can we find some longitudinal studies, which we still have few and far between, and really understand what's happening with the students from all the different angles? And I think there's a real need for that as well, in thinking about that.
I think the last thing I might add just very quickly is, in addition to those excellent points, just thinking about how the stakes do become higher at the higher grades. And some of it is related not just to enrichment like AP, but like graduation, or, you know, how much pressure high school teachers do feel to have their students pass classes to get a diploma. And so those students who are minoritized and labeled as in ways as not being proficient in English, for example, the choices about the kinds of opportunities afforded to them are very different than when they're elementary school students. So I think it sets up a set of structural differences that the students feel. They experience it as well. It's not just experienced by the school.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And thanks for everybody who's here in attendance as well. I think we can keep this webinar open a bit longer, because Laura just posted all of the links to all the different papers and give people a chance to cut and paste or link to those. And so, you know, we can continue the conversation as a few minutes longer if people would like, but I also want to offer an opportunity to close it out. So I know that we were committed to ending at 1:30, and so people don't have to stay longer than that. But thank you all for being here and for offering your insights from your papers. This has been really exciting conversation. There really are still many more questions. So feel free to stay around and keep conversing. Thanks again. So if you are willing to keep talking, one of the questions that came up that would be interesting to consider, though I don't know that we're the right panel to consider it, is what about non-Spanish, non-English? What about contexts of other languages and other bilingual programs? And if any of you have had experiences, what might be the differences in terms of student identity construction in spaces that are neither Spanish, English, or not Spanish, English bilingual?
I can speak about that a little bit. My daughter was in Chinese immersion for 3 years, and she continues to take classes weekly. And I kind of took advantage. I identify as Chicana Latina, and I kind of took advantage of how being an insider in a dual language program, the Spanish and English. And when I set foot into a Mandarin program, I realized that some of the key things that keeps me grounded in dual language and as a Spanish English bilingual are similar to what I thought might work in a Chinese English program, such as really looking at the heritage of Mandarin speakers, right? Is the Mandarin language. A lot of the parents were either from abroad or were born and raised here and didn't speak Mandarin, because there haven't been Mandarin programs in the US like there have been Spanish programs. And so they felt that loss. And so I think that's a piece of it, like looking at, it's kind of like the bilingual Spanish English programs do. We look at the cultural piece, right? There's also things that we've been talking about here today, the critical piece of it. So I think in some ways it's similar, and in some ways it's probably different that I'm not aware of.
I don't have experience with these programs, but one of my doc students did a study on Palestinian second generation young women and adolescents, and both the national discourse around Arab speaking students and then religious identity was huge. And so I would imagine that that will be a part of the identity discussion that would be much more front and center, rather than secondary or not even talked about. So that I can imagine that might be another difference.
If I could just add one more thing about that is this idea of being a guest in those programs. I kind of took that for granted also. And I really felt it was only validated for me as being a parent in a dual immersion program that was Chinese and Mandarin, the importance of recognizing that I was a guest, right? I'm not part of that culture and have very little ties to it. And I think that's a piece that needs to be explored as well. Like, what does it mean to be a guest in a program when your heritage isn't Chinese or Latinx?
Thanks. I don't want to hold us any longer, and I really, really appreciate the time that you all have given. This has been a great fun. I have the recording, and we will make that available, right, Maria, on the SIG's website, as well as the links to the articles. We have a handout we can put with it. So thanks all for attending. I think we'll close it up.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you,
so
everybody.
much.
Awesome
Thank you,
work.
everyone.
Thank you.
We did it.
You made it. Thanks, Deb.
Bye-bye.